Welcome back to my YouTube channel on Ayurveda yoga and a lot of related topics. And today I'd like to answer questions about the Kleshas in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. So I'd like you to press the like and subscribe button and become a member of this channel, and so you get the notification and you always can participate with your questions and my answers. So here we go. When Patanjali names the 5 Kleshas in Yoga Sutra 2.3, he does not raise his voice, he does not warn, he does not threaten, he simply names. Avidya, smita, raga, dvesha, abhinimesha, klesha. He says ignorance, ego identification, attachment, aversion, clinging to life. These are the afflictions. The word klesha is not equivalent to sin. It does not mean moral corruption. It means that which colors perception, that which distorts clarity, that which produces suffering because it bends reality. And what is astonishing is how psychologically exact this list is. When we read the Yoga Sutras superficially, they can appear abstract, almost metaphysical. But when we read them carefully, especially the book 2, where Patanjali describes the causes of suffering, we discover something startlingly contemporary. He is not describing ancient ascetics. He is describing us. He is describing even romantic confusion. He is describing identity rigidity. He is describing communication avoidance. He's describing affairs. He's describing jealousy. He is describing self-deception. And how is he doing that? He's describing how human beings misperceive. And everything begins with the first klesha, avidya. Let us now enter carefully. Yoga Sutra 2.5 states, translated by Edwin Bryant, ignorance is mistaking the impermanent for permanent, the impure for pure, the painful for pleasurable, and the non-self for the self. Nicholas Sutton renders it in nearly identical terms. Ignorance is the confusion of what changes with what does not change. Let us slow this down. Mistaking the impermanent for permanent. This is the root distortion. It is the assumption that what feels strong will remain strong, that what feels intense will remain intense, and that what comforts us now will always comfort us. It is the assumption that love should feel the way it felt in the first months. It is the assumption that admiration should not fade. It is the assumption that desire should not fluctuate. It is the assumption that identity should not shift. When we fall in love, intensity feels eternal. The nervous system lights up, novelty produces dopamine, projection produces transcendence, the world feels new, in that moment impermanence is invisible. But Patanjali says the distortion begins precisely here, when we mistake this phase for a stable ground. Erich Fromm saw this dynamic in modern romantic culture. In The Art of Loving, he writes that we commonly call love is often a temporary collapse of loneliness through mutual fascination. He distinguishes between falling in love and standing in love. Falling happens suddenly and feels absolute. Standing, though, requires discipline and commitment. Falling dissolves boundaries. Standing builds structure. If we mistake falling for standing, disappointment is inevitable. This is avidya. The impermanent was mistaken for permanent. The second layer of avidya is mistaking the impure for pure. Here, impure does not mean morally dirty. It means mixed. All human relationships are mixed. Love contains desire and irritation. Commitment contains ambivalence. Attraction contains projection. There is no unmixed experience in human life. Yet we often demand purity. We want love without frustration. We want commitment without boredom. We want freedom without responsibility. When the mixture appears, we assume corruption. Alain de Botton observed that modern couples often interpret ordinary frustration as a sign of incompatibility. We assume that if something feels complicated, it must be wrong. We forget that complexity is the structure of intimacy. Avidya whispers that love should be pure feeling. Reality replies that love is mixed. The third misperception is mistaking the painful for pleasurable. This is subtle and deeply psychological. We repeat patterns that hurt us because they are familiar. We are drawn to a dynamic that resembles childhood attachments, even when those attachments were unstable. C.G. Jung describes this repetition as the psyche's attempt to complete unfinished material. What feels familiar feels safe, even when it is painful. This is how someone repeatedly chooses unavailable partners while insisting they are seeking love. This is how someone confuses jealousy with passion. This is how someone confuses anxiety with depth. The final layer of avidya is mistaking the non-self for self. This is the most destabilizing distortion of all. We identify with our roles. We identify with our relationship status. We identify with being desired. We identify with being betrayed. We identify with being spiritual. We identify with being independent. Erich Fromm calls this the having orientation. We begin to experience ourselves through possession of status, of image, of admiration, of relationships. When these possessions shift, identity collapses. The Yoga Sutras insist that awareness itself is prior to all these roles. If I can observe jealousy, I am not identical to jealousy. If I can observe fear, I'm not identical to fear. If I can observe desire, I'm not identical to desire. Jung echoes this through individuation, the process of differentiating the ego from the deeper self. Individuation requires that we stop confusing persona with essence. Paul Watzlawick adds an indispensable relational dimension. Once a false premise is accepted, for example, conflict destroys love, communication reorganizes around protecting that premise. Silence increases. Avoidance deepens. Resentment grows quietly. Eventually, the relationship deteriorates, confirming the original fear. Avidya is not merely personal. It becomes systemic. It shapes how couples speak. It shapes how families organize. It shapes how culture defines romance. And here we must confront something uncomfortable. The modern misuse of non-attachment often begins in avidya. When someone says, "I am not attached," while pursuing novelty, they may be mistaking stimulation for freedom. They may be mistaking avoidance for transcendence. They may be mistaking projection for authenticity. Patanjali does not argue with them. He simply offers the diagnostic lens. Are you mistaking the impermanent for permanent? Are you mistaking intensity for essence? Are you mistaking role for self? The answer is yes. Avidya is operating. The remedy is not repression. It is not self-blame. It is discrimination, viveka. The disciplined ability to see that everything that arises will change. The disciplined ability to tolerate change without panic. The disciplined ability to love without demanding eternity. When avidya begins to dissolve, something extraordinary happens. Love becomes less dramatic. Identity becomes less rigid. Fear becomes less catastrophic. And freedom becomes possible, not because life stops changing, but because we stop demanding that it does not. Part 2. Asmita. The hardening of identity and the fear of revision. When Patanjali names the 5 Kleshas in Yoga Sutra 2.3, avidya, asmita, raga, dvesha, abhinivesha, he is not listing 5 separate psychological problems. He is describing a sequence, almost a structural unfolding. Avidya, misperception, lays the foundation. From misperception arises identity. From identity arise attraction and aversion. From attraction and aversion arises fear. Today we turn to the second klesha that one gives the distortion a face. Yoga Sutra 2.6 states that asmita is the apparent identification of the power of seeing with what is seen. This is one of the most psychologically subtle lines in all of classical philosophy. Patanjali is not condemning the ego in the modern moral sense. He is not criticizing ambition or personality. He is describing fusion. He is describing what happens when awareness becomes entangled with its own content. The seer forgets that it is the seer and begins to believe it is what it sees. Instead of experiencing anger, we become an angry person. Instead of feeling hurt, we become the wounded one. Instead of acting independently, we become the independent one. Instead of experiencing betrayal, we become the betrayed. The distinction is not linguistic, it's structural. When awareness fuses with narrative, flexibility disappears. Asmita is identity hardened into certainty. In the Sankhya framework that underlies the Yoga Sutras, Purusha is pure witnessing consciousness. Buddhi, Ahamkara and Manas are functions of Prakriti. Ahamkara, literally I maker, generates the sense of individuality, but in Sankhya, Ahamkara is still a product of nature, not the self. Yoga Sutra 2.6 is describing what happens when the seer confuses itself with Ahamkara. The confusion is not dramatic, it is subtle. It feels almost natural. Carl Gustav Jung's psychology offers a powerful parallel here. Jung distinguishes between the ego and the self. The ego is necessary. It is the center of conscious identity. But when the ego mistakes itself for the totality of us, it becomes inflated and fragile at the same time. This is precisely asmita. The ego becomes rigid because it must defend its boundaries. It must maintain coherence. It must protect its image. The more tightly identity is held, the more terrifying revision becomes. In relationship, this manifests with remarkable clarity. One partner becomes the rational one. The other becomes the emotional one. One becomes the spiritual one. The other becomes the practical one. These roles stabilize interaction. Over time, they crystallize. Each person unconsciously begins to perform the identity that the system expects. Paul Watzlawicks' work in communication theory demonstrates that relational systems reinforce such identities through recursive loops. If one partner responds emotionally and the other responds with detachment, each reaction confirms the role. Attempts to shift the role destabilize the system and provoke resistance. Asmita is not merely internal, it becomes systemic. Erich Fromm deepened this insight when he described the marketing orientation of modern identity. In society structured by performance and comparison, identity becomes something curated and defended. We present ourselves as products, we cultivate images, we maintain reputation, we become invested not in being, but in appearing. Fromm writes in To Have or To Be that modern individuals often experience themselves as commodities. When identity is commodified, criticism feels like a depreciation. Accountability feels like a loss of value. In this context, admitting error is not simply correcting behavior. It feels like dissolving the self. Bell Hooks addresses this in her reflections on love and accountability. She insists that genuine love requires responsibility, which includes the willingness to see oneself clearly. However, when identity is rigid, self-examination feels like betrayal of the self-image. Asmita makes humility threatening. Jung described the persona as the mask through which we meet the world. The persona is necessary. It allows us to function socially. But when persona is mistaken for the whole self, development stops. The person defends the mask rather than discovering what lies beneath it. This is why many relational conflicts are not about behavior, but about identity defense. Consider the person who defines themselves as non-attached. When confronted with the consequences of emotional distance, they may experience the challenge not as feedback, but as an attack on identity. To reconsider behavior would require reconsidering who they believe themselves to be. Asmita resists, though, revision. In the Bhagavad Gita, we find a related psychological insight. In chapter 3, Krishna describes how the gunas act upon the gunas. All actions are performed by the gunas of Prakriti. The one whose self is deluded by ego thinks, I am the doer. Here, Ahankara appropriates action and constructs identity around it. The individual believes, I am this action, I am this role, I am this success, I am this failure. Yoga does not eliminate personality. It loosens identification. When awareness distangles from narrative, something extraordinary happens. The person can say, I acted poorly, instead of I am worthless. The person can say, I was wrong, instead of I am destroyed. The person can say I am changing instead of I am betraying myself. Without this differentiation, growth is nearly impossible. Asmita is deeply connected to fear. If identity equals survival, then any threat to identity feels like death. This is why some people defend destructive patterns with astonishing intensity. The pattern may be harmful, but it is familiar, it is coherent. It is integrated into the self-image. Jung would say that such rigidity indicates shadow accumulation. The more we insist on being one thing, the more the opposite accumulates in the unconscious. The person who insists on being endlessly compassionate may just repress anger. The person who insists on being independent may repress longing for closeness. Because the repressed cannot remain unconscious indefinitely, it returns, often projected onto others. Projection protects identity. Asmita therefore sustains relational distortion not only through rigidity, but through displacement. We accuse others of what we cannot acknowledge in ourselves. We defend the narrative at the cost of truth. Patanjali's definition offers a radical remedy: distinguish the seer from the seen. If I can observe my defensiveness, then I'm not identical to defensiveness. If I can observe my need to be right, then I'm not identical to that need. If I can observe my fear of being abandoned, then I'm not identical to that fear. This is not dissociation. It is clarity. The Yoga Sutras describe this as viveka khyati, discriminative insight. When discriminative insight stabilizes, identification loosens naturally. The paradox is this: when identity softens, integrity strengthens. The person who is no longer fused with narrative can apologize without collapsing. They can change without feeling annihilated. They can remain in dialogue without defending a role. In contemporary discourse, authenticity is often equated with expressing whatever one feels in the moment. However, Fromm warns that spontaneity without reflection can be mere impulsivity. Authenticity requires self-knowledge, not merely expression. Asmita confuses expression with essence. The discipline of yoga invites a deeper authenticity, one rooted not in reaction, but in awareness. In practical terms, this means pausing before defending oneself. It means noticing the surge for identity defense and allowing it to settle. It means tolerating the discomfort of being seen imperfectly. This tolerance is the beginning of relational maturity. When two people meet without rigid identity defense, conversation changes. Conflict becomes exploration rather than warfare. Vulnerability becomes possible because survival no longer depends on being right. Asmita does not vanish overnight. It softens gradually as awareness deepens. The practice described in Yoga Sutra 1.2, Chitta Vritti Nirodha, the stilling of mental fluctuation, creates space between perception and identification. In that space, identity becomes fluid. Fluid identity is not chaos, it is adaptability. And adaptability allows love to mature. Without loosening asmita, raga and dvesha will continue to oscillate. Attraction and aversion will be interpreted as proof of selfhood. Every pleasure will reinforce identity. Every pain will threaten it. With loosening, something else emerges. Freedom not from identity, but from its tyranny. The seer remains. The roles shift. The narratives evolve. But awareness is not consumed by them. In that realization, the rigidity that produces so much suffering begins to dissolve. Asmita is not destroyed. It is contextualized. And when identity is no longer absolute, relationship becomes possible without self-annihilation. This is the quiet revolution Patanjali points toward. Not ego death, but ego transparency. Not personality erasure, but freedom from narrative captivity. When the seer remembers itself as seer, identity becomes tool rather than prison. And that subtle shift, the possibility of genuine intimacy begins. Thank you very much. This is part 1 and 2 of the Kleshas, and in the new podcast we continue with 3 with Raga. So I hope you enjoyed this. So please leave a like and subscribe, and see you then for the continuing of the Kleshas. Thank you very much. Bye bye.